Hey there and welcome to the channel. You're watching The Light in My Library. Today we're going to be talking about Full Moon by Jim Butcher, Book 2 of the Dresden Files. So in my review of Stormfront, I talked a lot about how that book was just gripping and a wild ride, and I have to say that he does deliver a very fast-paced book again here in Full Moon. And it is a very good follow-up to Stormfront. However, I am going to say that as far as Dresden books goes, comparatively to other Dresden books, Full Moon is definitely one of the weakest in the series so far. I'm only on book 11 right now, but it is not as strong of an outing for Dresden as some of the later books or as strong as Stormfront was. A lot of my favorite characters, specifically Billy and the werewolves, are introduced for the first time here in this book. So I guess it's not a lot of my favorite characters. It's really just Billy and the werewolves. But I do love them. They are some of my favorite characters in Dresden, and they're introduced for the first time here. It also does a lot of heavy lifting for establishing the tone of the Dresden Files, more so than Stormfront did. Stormfront was just so laser focused on blasting through to that ending and was riveting the entire way. And Full Moon takes some time to start laying groundwork for the larger series, not as much as later books, especially Summer Night, do, but it does start here to flesh out some of the things that were kind of blazed past in Stormfront. I mean, really the only setup that Stormfront did was the scene with Bianca. And aside from that, it just tried to go straight through. I guess it also introduced the concept of the Fae and the Wardens, but yeah. The biggest contribution by far that Full Moon makes to the Dresden Files is establishing the tone. So let's get into the review. In my Hero of Ages video, I pointed out a lot of highlights that I wanted to talk about for the book. I think I want to move that section, but I think I am also going to retain that. So we'll get to those after the review in the spoiler section, and we'll jump right into it. So for the pacing on this one, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. It's not quite as tightly paced as Stormfront was, but it is still a very fast-paced, very tightly written novel, and I do like it for that aspect. For characters, we're going to give this a 9 out of 10. This is a lot of development of Dresden in this book in particular, but also Susan, and like I mentioned earlier, it's the introduction of Billy and the werewolves, so top marks for that. For world building, we're going to give this book I'd say a 7 out of 10. Like I've mentioned, it's mostly tonal world building. Not a lot of new concepts are introduced, except for the werewolves, which I do have something to say in particular about the way that werewolves are handled in this book, but I'm going to save that for the spoiler section. You know what, I can't think of a fourth category for this book, so we're just going to go ahead to the overall rating, and I'll point out another time that my category ratings do not factor into the overall rating for the book in any way whatsoever. It is just what I choose to pick out for each individual book to highlight, either good or bad. And, actually, I thought of a fourth one. We're going to give this book for plot, not for pacing, but for plot, we're going to give it a 5 out of 10. And I'll get to why later in the spoiler section. But the story, the plot, that is the weak part of this particular Dresden Files novel. We're going to give this book an overall rating of 7 out of 10 stars. It is pretty good. And again, a 5 is an average book. And I'm not going to read a lot of average books because you're going to read books that are highly recommended and are automatically probably more good. So most books are going to be above 5 stars, but 5 is an absolutely fine book. Nothing offensive, nothing bad. So 7 out of 10 is a high rating on my scale. So let's move on to the spoiler section. We're going to do... we are going to hit briefly on spoilers for the next book in the series in relation to a particular character, but I'll try to save that one for the end. So, spoilers for Stormfront and Full Moon, starting now. Some of the moments I wanted to highlight in this one are... A moment that I wanted to highlight was the attack on the police station, as just very high-paced, high adrenaline, a little bit horrifying, but just a very a very cinematic scene that definitely sticks with me visually, and it's one of the strongest pictures that I've retained from this book. This one in particular, and just a very enjoyable scene to read, and I really liked the way that it was done. Another moment that I wanted to highlight, back-to-back moments actually, were Dresden's conversation with his subconscious. I feel like it really did a lot to develop Dresden as a character. It really did a lot to set up some of the later conflicts in the Dresden Files that I'm not going to touch on here. And then immediately after that scene, his love scene with Susan, it was very touching, very heartwarming. And I actually just barely reread that scene in preparation for this video. It's a very well-written, very heartfelt interaction that they have, and I remember distinctly the first time reading it that it had an emotional impact for me personally. So that is definitely a highlight of this book. So one thing I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about, the way that werewolves were handled, and by that I mean, at the beginning of the book, Bob gives Dresden a breakdown of all the different kinds of werewolves. And me reading Dresden Files, knowing that it's 19 books long or whatever it's currently at, I was like, okay, so there's going to be one, maybe two of these kinds of werewolves in this book. And then these other kinds of werewolves that Bob is talking about are going to be things that Dresden encounters later on down the line, like I can't remember all the names, the Hexenwolves and the Lycanthropes and all the different kinds. But then Butcher just goes ahead and puts all of the different kinds of werewolves that he had just introduced into this one in particular. So I can't remember if there's 4 or 5 different types of werewolves in this book, but it's definitely caught me off guard when reading it to see so many different, I didn't expect all of the different kinds to show up. And so that caught me off guard on reading. I wanted to talk briefly more about the reason I gave the story for this book, the plot, such a low rating. And that is, so I mentioned, and the reason for that is, as I mentioned, I read the first 3 books in the Dresden Files about a year ago, and Full Moon was the one that stood out the least to me in my memory. I had to go with Stormfront, and with the next book, I'm able to recall them fairly decently, but Full Moon just doesn't stick out to me in the same way, and I had to go back and read a synopsis and skim through the book again very quickly in preparation for this video. And so that's kind of where I think it's just not as well... It's just not as focused story-wise. The plot is still very tight and definitely goes along... Sorry, not the plot. The pacing is still definitely very tight and goes along in a very nice clip. But the story in this book just doesn't seem to be as concise. I honestly think that introducing all of the different kinds of werewolves and splitting the story's focus between all of them was a little bit of a mistake on Mr. Butcher's part, in my opinion. So I mentioned briefly earlier that there was going to be spoilers for the next book in the Dresden File in this video. And that is because it's more by implication. It's not going to give away a direct story out. Well, it's more an implication for the next book. But I was definitely caught off guard when reading this one how quickly Susan and Harry's relationship developed. Because, again, reading Dresden Files and knowing that it's 17 books long, I was expecting their relationship to take 5 or 6 or even 7 books, or maybe even the whole time to develop to its fullest. And they're just tight right there together in this book. And that definitely caught me off guard. But it makes a lot more sense once you read the next book. So, look forward to that review coming soon. Also, I definitely need to mention quickly a character that I don't believe I highlighted in the first video, and that is Bob the Skull. Bob the Skull is one of the best characters of the Dresden Files, and definitely a selling point for the series. Alright, thank you for watching this video. Tune back in next week. I will be hopping back over to some Brandon Sanderson novel, probably. I haven't decided for sure which one I'm going to do, but keep an ear to the ground for that. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at The Light in My Library for both of those, where I post updates about upcoming videos and other things of that nature, and just kind of whatever's on my mind. I also have a Twitch where I stream every Tuesday and Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and every other Sunday at noon, and you kind of just do classic games there. It's really chill time. If you want to hop over and give me a follow on that platform, I'd really appreciate it. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment if you will, and I hope you have a good one.